Shaka, this is not the first time that all African leaders are headed to Beijing for their, maybe I should call it annual summit, what has become like an annual summit of sorts, to go and pay homage to the Chinese president, who, by the way, made good on his promise, $60 billion in addition to what China is already doing in Africa. Your thoughts?
Does that, by the way, include also the king, the absolute monarch of Swaziland? Because the last time I checked, he seems to be doing business with Taiwan.
Incredible. That was fascinating in a sense that he's the almost the only person who didn't show up for that Beijing conference.
Very interesting. Of course, China is doing a lot of things in Africa. You and I have seen some of these things, as a matter of fact. We saw some of these things on hand in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We saw some of these things in the Republic of Zambia. You remember the Dr. Kenneth Kaunda International Airport. It's under enormous renovation and expansion, and you name it. We saw some of these things in Zimbabwe. We also, I also saw some of these things manifested in Malawi. So there is no question when you look at the fact that you also had a privilege of being a beneficiary of Chinese, marvelous engineering in Kenya. When you rode, this marvelous train from Mombasa to Nairobi, and you told me it was an incredible piece of technology. It was obviously technologically on the cutting edge. It was very comfortable and what have you. But earlier today, there was someone else who apparently also passed through that particular experience from Mombasa to Nairobi, and you can't believe what he was saying. It was almost the reverse of what you were sharing with us. What's happening? This guy says the train, in fact, is not comfortable. And it is not as fast as you think it is. In fact, it almost takes the same time from Nairobi from Mombasa to Nairobi. Almost takes the same time with the truck. Truck takes 7 hours.
No, that's not true.
Truck 7 hours, and that this one takes 6 hours.
No, that's not true. That's not true. Maybe they have a very different version of their own facts.
Are you talking about alternative facts?
I think so.
Do those exist?
Yeah, because at least I can attest to the fact that I rode on that train 2 times. And at no time, unless if they had an accident maybe on the road, at no time
he said
did it take 7 hours from Mombasa to Nairobi.
He said 6 hours. And part of the problem, he says, probably is they stop on 6 different stations. Okay, so
there he's correct. If everything happens on time, it takes about 5.5 hours from Mombasa to Nairobi. That's the train that goes through the counties. That makes different stops. But if you take the express train, it's under 5 hours.
He also says that a lot of Kenyans really are mad about that, by the way, because Kenyans, in fact, don't seem to really have ownership of the project, because most of the jobs are in fact done by Chinese.
True, they have a point there, but the facts are, first of all, this was a huge infrastructure development. Kenya borrowed almost $3.8 billion to boot.
And how is it going to pay for it?
Well, it's a long-term process. Shaka, maybe I can make an argument here. I think all countries borrow. There is no country that can grow without borrowing. Even businesses, a simple business, you can't grow if you can't borrow money.
You are right, but you do not borrow recklessly, because in fact there is an article, there's an argument that actually Africa is in huge trouble, especially because of the manner in which it has actually borrowed money from China.
You have a point there, but again, I want to go back to this same argument. The United States of America borrows money from China. Right now, United States borrows more money than any other continent or any other country combined from China. Why are they borrowing money?
The issue is not about borrowings. The issue is whether, in fact, you are borrowing simply because you are living beyond beyond your capacity.
That's not true. I mean, I think as African countries' economies continue to grow, they are going to need all this infrastructure development. That's one of the reasons they are borrowing money. A lot of, yes, true, some countries will incur debt that they can't pay off over a long term. It will take years, for example, for a country like Kenya that even has a great economy to pay off some of those debts. But eventually, long-term goals, these infrastructure projects create employment for the local people. For example, the Kenyan...
If in fact they create employment.
Absolutely,
also,
absolutely. There's no question about it.
If in fact you put that money to good use, not everywhere that seems to be the case. In fact, in some countries, some of the money that is being borrowed is reflected in Kajansi type of houses, which are personal, belonging to very powerful individuals, not the community.
Again, now, that's the weakness of the institutions themselves, the countries themselves. They haven't come up with a framework.
The leadership.
Yes, a framework to fight this corruption. Obviously, if you had a multi-billion-dollar corporation like the Kenya Railways Corporation, you have access to unlimited funding, or access to resources, you can do whatever you want. But the question here, maybe let me pose this question to Shaka. Why is it that a lot of people talk about China's investment in Africa, looking at it in the context of colonialism? Is that how you see it?
Oh, I think there are reasons sometimes to actually, look at it that way, because let's face it, no country comes to the help of another country simply because of what they call altruism. No. It's about a country's vital national security interests. China is not in Africa because it's just a good guy, because it loves Africa. Africa is not a beautiful woman. China is there precisely because it can benefit from that interaction. And it is benefiting. The question is now, what about the African leaders, and I will probably call most of them rulers? Are they aware of the fact that they too have their own vital national security interests? So that, in fact, when you have China, in addition to Turkey, to Brazil, to India, and probably to the Western, system as we have known it, it means, frankly, that if you're an African leader, especially, you have an opportunity because you have options. You can take advantage of these options for the benefit of your own people. But you see, you can only do that if you are a leader like the Madiba, Nelson Mandela, the late South African president, who once said, what counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It's what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life that we lead.
That's a great quote, Shaka, but I could also tie that to what is happening. Again, going back to borrowing money in China. So we talk about how our leaders have failed to develop the infrastructure. We talk about how our leaders have failed to give people social like amenities, like hospitals and roads and whatever. And China
service delivery.
Yes,
but the first infrastructure,
China is doing that wrong.
The first infrastructure that need to be developed, as a matter of fact, is human. It is the mind. It is not roads, not railways, not airports. It's human. You have to make sure that your people feel that they actually have ownership of these projects, that these ownership belong to them, and therefore they are in the best position to defend them because they need them.
But Shaka, again, there is no shortage of human capital on the continent. For the first time ever, we have more educated young people on the continent. You like to use the word intellectual balance of power has been shifting in our favor. You have a lot of young educated people.
Educated on paper. What have you been able to do with that balance of power shifting in our favor?
Yes. What they don't have is that infrastructure that they can use.
Most of those people, by the way, the last time I checked, are unemployed.
But when you have infrastructure developments like this coming into the country, there's going to be employment created.
Yeah, but you need skill sets that are in a situation where they can benefit from whatever kind of physical infrastructure that you put in place. I mean, we're looking at Kenya, for example. They have that great train, yes, but who is actually driving that train? It's not the Kenyans, even though they were trained.
True. Actually, that's not correct. They are still training. It takes about 5 years to train a train driver.
Man. Come on, man.
You have a lot of young people who are doing apprentices or internships to be potential train drivers. You have a lot of people. It has created over 40,000 jobs.
It's very interesting that you actually helped walk me back in memory lane to when I was a very, very much younger guy. We had, for example, the Uganda Air Force. We had the police air wing. And guess who were actually piloting the police air wing helicopters? They were Europeans. And what was the argument? That Africans cannot fly a helicopter. I was in Burundi at one time, and Burundi had engineers, lawyers, doctors, and what have you. But my friend, they had an army that was called a Tutsi mono-ethnic army. And the reason is very simple. When I asked them why did they have diversity, because they invited me to the officers' mess, there was not a single Hutu. There was not a single, you can't believe this. There was not a single Muganwa. The elite, there was just Tutsi in the officers' mess. When I asked her, I said, can you produce for me 1, 2, 3, at least non-Tutsi? They just looked at me and laughed. I said, why don't you have army officers from these communities? And I was told, sincerely, without a shame, that these guys could not pass the aptitude in order to join the military academy. But these guys could actually be engineers, they could be doctors, they could be lawyers, but they could not be army officers.